The question is, why do so many people, so many Christians, so many theologians through the ages have had difficulty with the book of James? Well, the whole difficulty stems from just 7 verses, pretty much. About a dozen verses, but primarily 7 of them, at the end of chapter 2. And that's what we're getting into. Before we do it verse by verse, I'm going to do a summary of what's going on from 20 to 26 in chapter 2 of James, and why people get confused by it. And the whole point of this whole series on the second half of the second chapter of James is to inform people of what the reality that's going on in this letter is, that he's saying the same thing as Paul, as Moses, and as the writer of Hebrews. This whole story of Abraham's faith is told by Moses in Genesis. It is told by Paul in Romans 4. It is told by the Hebrews writer in Hebrews chapter 11. And it is told by James in this passage. Each one focuses on a different facet of the story of Abraham's faith, but all are focusing primarily, although they look at different facets, the point, the central point for each one is Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness, which is the basis of our salvation faith. Each one looks at it from a different angle and so describes a different facet of this jewel, Abraham's faith. So we will be examining the scriptures to some degree in all 4 of these locations, primarily these 7 verses in James.
An interest in the Savior's blood, died he for me, who caused his pain, for me who him to death pursued.
James chapter 2, verses 20 through 26. You foolish man. I'm going to stop there. Who is this foolish man? Well, up in verse 14, he said, what good is it, my brother, if a man, that's the man, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? That is who he's addressing. He has addressed him from the point of view of the compassionate man. A few verses later, he addresses this man from the point of view of the practical, common sense man. He has addressed it from the point of view of the man who is focused on spiritual warfare and the enemy and the forces of the enemy. And now he will discuss it from the point of view of the person focused on the Old Testament narrative, of which the big hero is Abraham. You foolish man, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scriptures were fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. In the same way, actually goes on with Rahab. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them in a different direction. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. We're going to focus now on Abraham. Rahab is put in at the end because she's the example of the one who is a Gentile, not part of the tree, which is the olive tree, or the vine, which is Israel. So both illustrations are used by God. But she is grafted in. She's grafted into the olive tree of Israel because of her faith. That's why she's the Gentile. Abraham is the first of the Jews, first of the Jewish nation. And so we focus there. Why is there such a difference between Paul in Romans and James here? And why do people complain? Well, they complain, and we'll get into more detail when we go verse by verse, because when it says Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, oh, that's a different place in Genesis from when he offered his son. It doesn't say Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness when he offered Isaac. It says that before, on and on. Well, guess what? Paul does the same thing. He says Abraham believed God, it was credited to him as righteousness, and then he proves that point with a story from Abraham's life. And most people, when they read Romans 4, they don't go back to Genesis to see that he's doing the same thing James did. He doesn't go to the sacrifice of Isaac, but he goes to the events leading up to the birth of Isaac in the year before Isaac was born. And he says that is what proves that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That happened more than a decade after the place where Moses says Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Well, then you go to Hebrews, and there are multiple events from Abraham's life that are recorded in Hebrews 11. And it always says by faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went. By faith. Okay? By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father. Now that's the example that Paul uses. But the time when Abraham looked up at the stars, and it's right there that it says, that Moses says Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, that happens about halfway between the two that I just mentioned in Hebrews 11. It also says, by faith he made his home in the promised land. By faith he lived in tents, as did his son and grandson. By faith, and then he says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. The same one that James uses. But we go into Genesis, and we see that all of these are mentioned, but when Moses wrote, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, it was after he had, by faith, gone to the promised land, after he had, by faith, lived as a sojourner in the promised land, and when God told him, who was married to an old barren woman, that his offspring would be so great they couldn't be counted, then it says Abraham believed God. People ask the question sometimes. It shows a lot of misunderstanding of Bible times and everything else. You know, they'll say in Sunday school class, but when did Abraham ask Jesus into his heart? By the way, the phrase ask Jesus into your heart, or into my heart, or into his heart, never appears as that phrase in the Bible. It talks about dwelling in your heart through faith, but that's not That's different. It's a different wording. But what they're really asking, leaving aside the question of before the cross and so on, they're really asking, when did Abraham get transferred from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light? When was he saved? When did his faith save him? And that's because we have a focus on the moment of salvation, when the Bible has a focus on a life of faith. A life of faith. And that's what we have with Abraham. And so when Moses says Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, he is saying broadly that for most of Abraham's life, certainly from the time before God called him to go to a land that he had not seen and that God would show him, from sometime before that all the way to the end of his life, Abraham believed God, and God was crediting that belief to him as righteousness. That is the point, because when we see all the different New Testament writers pointing to different places in Abraham's life and pointing to it and saying, see, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. By faith. When it says by faith he went to the promised land, the Hebrews writer is talking about saving faith. So he already had, and well, how do we know that that's saving faith? Let's go to Romans 4. That was the proof that I wanted to go to. In Romans 4, the part I don't cover in my Romans 4 lesson is the part about David. And when and as he shifts from Abraham to David and then goes back to Abraham again, Romans 4 verse 4, now when a man works, his wages are not credited to him as a gift, but as an obligation. However, the man. Which man? Abraham? David? You? Me? Yes. Yes, that man. And that woman. Now when a man works, his wages are not credited to him as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the man who does not work, but trusts God to justify the wicked. Now he's not saying to the man who has no works. He's saying to the man who does not work. He does not work for his salvation. He doesn't come before God and say, look what I did, because I did this good thing, save me. But to the man who does not work, but trusts God who justifies the wicked. I have to do a lesson on that. That is one of the strongest verses in the Bible. It's a lot stronger than the English makes it seem. But who trusts God who justifies the wicked, his faith is credited as righteousness. David says the same thing when he speaks of the righteousness to the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are they whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will never count against him. Whoever has that faith and trusts in God, it is credited to him as righteousness. So when Abraham went to the promised land, before Moses puts it in the verse, it was being credited to him as righteousness, his faith, which resulted in his action of going. That's what this is about. And now, as we go on with the lessons, we will go through this verse by verse. Pick up the details, pick up any objections.